here by our three speakers for today: Tom Marsden, leader of the Canadian Government Solutions Team; Adam Morehouse, senior economist; and Christie Zuk, Canadian market subject matter expert at Dun & Bradstreet. Before I hand it over to Tom to kick off the webinar, allow me to just take a minute to go through some basic logistics. First, we will be recording this call and sharing the on-demand replay for those of you who wish to share the content with your colleagues. At the end of the session, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A pod. Please don't use the chat pod. The reason for using only the Q&A pod is so we can compile the information in one central location. Upon entry to the call, you may have noticed that everyone is muted. However, if you do have a question that's too complex or too long for the Q&A pod, feel free to raise your hand and we'll simply unmute your line and you'll be able to ask your question live. So our agenda for today is the new normal for revenue collections post-pandemic, the business environment in Canada, using data to support new strategies, and how to get business value from investment in data, our pandemic playbook, and we will end it with a Q&A session. So I believe we're now ready to get started. Over to you, Tom.
Great, thank you, Sherry. And welcome, folks, and thank you for your interest and participation in the webinar. Appearing on your screen is a one-question poll. We're looking to get a baseline on the most significant challenges to your collection activities due to the pandemic. So feel free to select one or multiple responses. And while that is being tallied, let me get started. And that information will be shared on the screen. So we all know how disruptive the pandemic has been on our lives. Government agencies, businesses, and all of us as individuals have been impacted. And that'll continue. There is definite financial impact on businesses, us as individuals, and government agencies play a critical role in bolstering the public sector to provide us all with the safety and health and welfare that we need. The visibility into the world of data and the world of business is critical in these times. If we cannot quickly ascertain the impact of the pandemic on the business community, then it's difficult to make decisions. It's difficult to make decisions, certainly, that have where there's the opportunity to be more efficient and more compassionate. Look at the number to your right on the total number of businesses impacted by the pandemic in high impact areas. And we know what those are: retail, some extent manufacturing, travel industry, massive impacts there. D&B has identified that there are 30 million businesses globally impacted by the pandemic in these so-called hot zones. Now, if you could turn to the next slide, please. If we think about that number and what goes into that number, you can maybe start to appreciate how we get there, how Dun & Bradstreet is able to harness the data resources in our possession, which date back in decades, and make use of that to ascertain current operational status of businesses anywhere. We do that with the Dun & Bradstreet Data Cloud. The Data Cloud is what links the, I'm sorry, I've got to minimize a window here. The data cloud is what makes this possible. It's that access to the comprehensive business data, analytic insights to power your performance, the performance of our customers globally, of which there's 140,000 commercial and government organizations. The live business identity enables that gluing together of disparate data sources so we get a single source of truth. And the data cloud doesn't operate in a vacuum. In fact, it sits on pillars. And first pillar is global coverage. We cover the world. 30,000 trusted data sources, some 200 countries, information that is updated continuously, requiring no intervention by any of the businesses that are part of this database. Most importantly is governance and quality. You cannot submit a single source of truth without knowing that on a global basis, you have governance covered, policies, standards, structured approaches to data. You cannot offer the source of truth without knowing, having great confidence in the quality of that information. These two words, underscore a large financial commitment by Dun & Bradstreet and an ongoing expansion of these activities going forward. Make no mistake about it, governance and quality are key to everything that we do. From the global coverage and knowing that we've got stewardship and data quality processes to give us a data set from which we can draw insights and analytics is the next step for us in this journey. We're more than a data company. We are a company of insights and analytics, and we draw on the repository that's continually developed and maintained. And lastly, we make it accessible. We make it accessible through modern connections, direct connections as APIs. We also have a host of interactive online portals that give our customers the ability to get in, interact with the data and the insights, and retrieve that information instantaneously. Next slide, please. Here we go. Thank you. I want to start with words from Prime Minister Trudeau. And I've underlined a portion that I think is particularly relevant for us. Things will change in this world, our world. Things have changed in our world. They will continue. This does have an element of inevitability, and perhaps that's true, but there's also and I think this is why data is more relevant and impactful now than ever before, is you can control collection operations, revenue collection operations with insights about the business account base or portfolio handled by your agency. You're not stuck operating in the dark and relying on standard, reporting and disclosure activities that have been in place for decades and have served your agency well. But now we have to do things a little differently. So a couple of things there. Operating in the pandemic is about realizing and expressing this, that we're in this together. This is the part about compassion, recognizing our neighbors, our fellow business people, the community organizations that support us. Everyone is in this together. You can't be compassionate in our world without using data to drive decision-making during the pandemic, and certainly after, as we evolve into a new normal. Next slide, please. And this is what I have in mind for the new normal. This is a framework. It's a model for thinking about where we are as we define this new normal and the activities that form the approach. The assessment stage, we can't say enough about the importance of this. Determining the current operational status of business customers. Do you know that? Are you able to get that from the information that you currently collect and from the business customer base? Do you know which firms are directly impacted by the pandemic? Have you been able to establish a baseline profile of the firms that are experiencing significant financial stress prior to World Health Organization declaring the pandemic in early March? And do you know the risks of this new normal universe so that you can act now going forward? The pivoting that's required, and I say required, we know all of this is happening, and the folks on the phone here are not operating in a vacuum by any means. We're not suggesting that. But we're putting emphasis around the pivot, and that is take a look at your existing viability models, think about the predictive scores that are available in the marketplace that look out 12 months and predict the financial viability, among other factors, with your business account base. And then transform. Use trusted data, third-party sourced, to augment your existing internal data sources. Take stock of your workflows and please use the data and resources that are available here to practice compassionate collections, because everything we're talking about, you can do today. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Adam. Next slide.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I want to kick things off in this next section by really setting the stage by first looking through a macroeconomic lens, followed by a look at some of the risks that remain present, as well as getting insight into different metrics of activity to understand where we are in the recovery process within Canada. But let's start things off by having with a comparative look at the pandemic and really how it's unfolding. If we compare the growth rates in the number of cases in the US versus Canada, Canadians had fared considerably better than the US in combating the spread of the coronavirus. However, we're seeing a change in that growth pattern. Now, while total case count in Canada is far less than the US, the recent rise in that weekly moving average can create business risk that we need to be cognizant of. Canada's lower growth rate has enabled the reopening process and created some levels of confidence among consumers and businesses. But if we use the US as an example, that earlier this year recorded a spike in growth, we can understand the problems that bore out of a rapid reversal within the growth rate. We saw the reinstatement of business shutdowns, rises in initial unemployment claims, and ultimately a stalling in the economic recovery. Behaviorally, people have tended to avoid congregating in high contact areas out of precaution. So even without mandatory business restrictions, the evolution of the pandemic is influencing economic outcomes. Looking at growth in COVID cases on a provincial basis, possibly with the exception of British Columbia, we're really seeing a broad acceleration in cases with specific concerns among rises in major population centers such as Quebec and Ontario. Now, while the government has not stated that the second wave will immediately lead to renewed shutdowns, the possibility remains and could certainly divert resources that were intended for economic recovery. Next slide, please. Now, similar to other advanced economies, Canada is recovering from a broad-based deep contraction that occurred in April. Activity levels are rebounding, whether we're looking at the manufacturing segment through shipments and new orders, retail trade, which rose above pre-COVID levels in June, to consecutive monthly improvements in employment. Now, following the initial surge, we believe that the recovery is entering a more mature, distinct phase in which future gains will become a little harder to come by. And we see that within some of the data. For one, employment gains are cooling, and much of that recovery is being led by gains in part-time work. Some large hurdles have already been overcome, such as the lifting of the initial widespread lockdowns, but other large hurdles remain, including the ongoing border closure with the US and ongoing travel restrictions. Rises in part-time work is also a cautious development. It's an indication that businesses are rehiring, but they're being very cautious about it. So keep that in mind, that many of these jobs come with reduced hours. There are many different paces to the recovery, many different effects on different sectors, and that's something we see within our own data, which we'll certainly look at shortly. Keep in mind that despite improving headline numbers, employment is still quite far from the pre-COVID peak, and business survey information, in this case from the Reserve Bank of Canada, indicated that in Q2 that uncertainty around future sales would be a major drag on operations, and that will also affect future employment. Now, these results were taken near the height of the pandemic, so more recent business survey information has improved off of these lows through September, but these figures are still running well below their long-term average. That divergence between hard and soft data, and I want to just pause to explain what I mean by hard and soft data. Hard data such as sales figures or number of employees, really things that Dun & Bradstreet specializes in, versus soft data such as survey data, let's say how confident a company or individual is important in terms of velocity of and direction of the recovery. So while we have things like Canadian factory orders rising sharply to satisfy growing Canadian and US demand for automobiles and parts, and growing demand, certainly what we're seeing within Canadian softwood lumber, the limited rise and even slight decline in business confidence that occurred in August likely indicates we're approaching a near-term top in the pace of that recovery. Next slide, please. Now, given the way the data and recovery is unfolding, we believe that even with the improvement in recovery so far, it will take at least 3 years to recover the level of output we were likely to have hit at the end of 2020. We had just highlighted recovery within the goods segment, and some of that's being driven from new demand for both durable and non-durable stay-at-home goods. But as you can see from the breakdown of monthly GDP, a large portion of Canadian growth is service-driven, and the service industry still remains in rather poor shape. It's rather beaten up still. An extension of the US-Canadian border closure will continue to put pressure on the tourism, transportation, and consumer services categories. The generation of export services, which largely comes from the United States, can amount to over about $130 billion a year. So it's very specific to the outlook. Now, if we mix that with recent declines in wages in construction, manufacturing, and most service sectors, and the recovery growth rate certainly has limitations. Now, typically we do see greater declines in wages than we have. So if we combine that concept certainly with the risk of new shutdowns and the slowing of activity indicators, that's likely to be realized still in the months ahead. It creates kind of an interesting factor. Survey data can very much help dictate speed and direction. Lower consumer expectations for spending growth typically precedes a drop in retail trade. And ultimately, the deep links between the US and Canada, the US recovery is very important for reviving of growth in Canada. Let's go ahead and skip to the next slide. So I promised earlier in the presentation that we would take a look at what Dun & Bradstreet's Data Cloud commercial database was currently telling us. So we can actually calculate through all of our massive data set what effect on businesses a partial or full lockdown at the provincial level would have on the provincial economy through a lens of high and low contact businesses. This becomes relevant as the threat from rising COVID-19 cases re-enters the picture. And we can understand what share of businesses will be impacted by those measures. So as the virus, the pandemic ebbs and flows, certainly as we head into this fall, we can see what percentage of businesses are disrupted in the present time and over time. So since mid-August, most provinces have seen a rise in the percentage of businesses disrupted. But what I think is interesting to me is that some of the highest recorded shares of disrupted businesses remain within the energy patch and are certainly showing up in Alberta. Although the percentage share is slightly improving, it's an indication of the vulnerability of doing business within that province or within businesses that operate within that province. Now, this is a very high macro level look at some of the data sets. And I think I can help you get an understanding, but it should be used as a precursor to our micro data sets that we can certainly give you access to, and hopefully you have access to currently. Next slide. So our commerce tracker that we just showed you has very similar characteristics to Dun & Bradstreet's COVID-19 index. That's a level of insight that we've been really hard at work developing in the analytics department. So we've been applying our rich commercial data cloud to create a way for firms to measure the recovery and the impact from the pandemic. And before we look at the results, I think it's important to explain what we're capturing here. Our COVID-19 index for Canada measures 3 subcomponents, including macroeconomic elements like unemployment by industry, by SIC breakdown, which is reflective of the province, location attributes such as positive COVID case growth, lockdown status and mobility data, blended with our classic risk measures like our failure and delinquency score, as well as viability rating. And we get some interesting provincial level insight that we blend together to get a picture about the health of a geography or industry. So month over month, the declines within the index were pretty much across the board, with the exception of Quebec and British Columbia. But businesses within Quebec are noticeably weak, and a lot of that has to do with elevated risk scores for businesses in that region. Meanwhile, strength within British Columbia is being displayed from improved mobility data and slowing growth in the number of positive COVID cases. Additionally, the early September slowdown in positive cases in Manitoba has helped that province's score in recent weeks, but with a recent turn higher in cases, likely mean that an improvement may be kind of short-lived. And that's something I want to emphasize here. It's important to check the trends and direction because it will help you forecast as well as the measure of impact on revenue collection. As things change, typically when growth contracts, that's lost revenue and potential revenue. So it's always important to kind of keep an eye on the macro picture. In fact, we always say here in analytics, we take a micro to macro approach, and macro to micro and vice versa, because it helps us inform clients. If we turn pretty quickly to the industry breakdown of our COVID-19 index, it confirms to us what we hear and see in other data. We see this 3-tiered economy at play, in which there is a sector that is carrying on well. Our first tier that we highlighted here is doing better than most due to a mix of some favorable macro factors, such as favorable employment figures, as well as limited business restrictions due to low contact. And I think the latter factor may help to actually explain the prior in that statement. And we've got the second tier of businesses. These are types of businesses with scores that are recovering off their April lows, but are still recording a fair amount of risk and remain damaged. You'll notice some businesses that we've selected to show are catching wind in their sails and have improved with an improving macro environment, while some such as the oil and gas extraction sector are receiving poorer scores due to commodity swings and exposure, and that can partly explain continued weakness in the Alberta province. And there's of course, a third tier of businesses, which are types of firms that are high contact or ones that are deemed non-essential or in the hospitality industry, and they're still underperforming the pack and remain in severe duress. So even though we get a wide variety of headlines, I think it's more important than ever to increasingly remain selective within your business decisions. And I think that last point actually creates a really good transition point to pause. We're going to first provide another polling question before I turn the presentation over to my colleague, Christie Zuk.
Thanks, Adam. We'll just wait for the poll. There we go. I'll give folks a minute to answer that. Great. With all this detailed micro and macro information that Adam has shared with you and the overall impact that Tom has also shared with you, in the outcome for today's discussion, we really want to share with you best practices. And in order to start you along that journey, I wanted to share with you some findings around the Canadian marketplace in specific. So within the DB Canadian database, there is about 2.5 million active records, exclusive of branch locations or foreign branch locations. And just as important, there's about 2 million records that have fallen into our out-of-business database. This out-of-business database, coupled with our active database, gives us an incredible resource for building predictive models to identify different characteristics of outcome and behavior of an organization. Most specifically applicable to the Canadian marketplace is the view of whether an organization falls within a category of high risk, and high risk of failure or operational cessation, any kind of act that's going to shutter the business's doors, whether they seek legal relief or simply walk away without legal relief. And I don't expect numbers of 5, because there is overlap between the views of the businesses as we see them. But when we pull together and create multiple dimensions of a company that has high risk of failure, and then marry that to the likelihood of a company becoming severely delinquent, we're able to start to separate the businesses into different categories of not just the health and stability of an organization, but also to some extent the characteristics and behavior of an organization, to truly identify the segments of your portfolio that you need to be focusing your collection efforts on, because they have a much higher likelihood of prolonged delinquency, severe delinquency, or even worse, the likelihood of them not being able to meet their financial obligations to you at all. So I've captured a snapshot of the Canadian database. This information is updated in our database on a daily basis, but I wanted to provide you with the insight to then be able to marry your own portfolio and find out how does your database stack up against the national average in Canada, and then also be able to help you draw different approaches to the different characteristics and segments of each segment. So what we find on a national perspective in segment 1, these are companies with very little likelihood of failure. They're financially sound, stable, typically larger sized organizations with enough cash reserves and ability to pivot their organization to be able to survive the COVID economic crisis. And also very little likelihood of them becoming severely delinquent with you. So these are the customers or the businesses that you're dealing with that are stable and solid. And if you do find that your portfolio is under-indexed in this segment or over-indexed in this segment, it does present an opportunity for you to change your processes and your policies as dictated to marry to this segment. The second segment is the segment of customers that, again, are very low risk of failure or bad debt or loss, but a higher level of severe delinquency. And this could be triggered by the industry that they're in, whether or not there's an impact in their overall cash flow. But actually, more often than not, we see these businesses as companies that are using their suppliers and their financing vehicles to self-finance themselves. So if I was going to focus my efforts on a segment of my business to drive the most activity around collections, I could feel somewhat confident in moving my line of sight off of segment 1 and segment 2, because there is a very high likelihood that they will pay either on time or slightly delinquent, however, low risk of there being a bad debt or a loss associated with these accounts. The third segment we see is businesses with a very high risk of failure and also an unusual stability around the delinquency. We call these the blind sides. So these are customers or businesses that are not likely to show up on your collection activity list or your radar because they typically do pay on time, and that they will pay on time right to the very end. They're leveraging many different sources of financing. It could be something indicative around their industry that is cash driven. And until they reach the end of their line, they're going to pay their bills on time, and then it will be a blind side. And just out of interest around this segment, the largest bankruptcy in Canadian history with the most amount of unsecured dollars was Jetsco, and this was an organization that paid their bills to within 7 days of terms up to the night before they filed for bankruptcy. So to be able to bridge the information and what you know about the business and their behavior with you against what we also see from a third-party perspective, looking at failure and looking at delinquency, this is going to help trigger and identify these types of accounts where you really want to have a concentrated and a strategic plan around the collection of outstanding receivables or payments for these segments. The last segment, 16.5% nationally, these are the businesses that have a very high likelihood of failure, very high likelihood of severe delinquency. And to be able to identify those and prioritize your collection activities with a little bit less compassion will drive the results that you're looking for and minimize the losses associated. The last segment, segment 5, is utilizing a completely different predictive outlook. And because Canada is a marketplace of such small and mid-sized businesses who don't often leverage an actual act of bankruptcy or a filing, these are the organizations that are simply going to shut their doors, walk away, leave unpaid obligations, but not actually seek legal relief. And right now, the segment of the Canadian portfolio that falls in this category is just shy of 25%. So we provide you with this overview so that you in turn can marry this type of insight to your own portfolio and find out where you fall, but also more importantly, to derive the collection activities around the segments 3, 4, and 5 for the most amount of minimization of the risk and the losses associated with that. Please go to the next slide, please. Another layer beyond looking at simply the business itself is to be able to look at the relationship of that company within their own family tree. And 1 in 5 businesses in Canada is related to another organization. And it might surprise you that the top countries that we do find such large interrelationship are high risk or frictional countries such as Brazil and Mexico, and less stable countries are countries like Malaysia. So knowing the family tree status and being able to look up the family tree at who your client is owned by or what their interdependency upon other businesses in other parts of the world becomes even more important in this day and age of COVID. I actually had a customer who is suffering significantly during COVID shutdown, not because of the impact in their geography, but the structure of their organization was such that all of their billing was processed through Middle Eastern country, and that they weren't actually able to easily transition to work from home operations to be able to send out invoices and process cash applications. So they were suffering purely because of shared services with a company outside of their own geographical region. Next slide, please. We do recommend in this journey of compassionate collections is some critical milestones that we recommend. First is to take a look at, and if you don't have one already, but it's to take a look at what your risk-based assessment and your approach to either new clients or existing clients, so that you have a very good understanding of what your tolerance is for risk in this day and age as it compares to perhaps where you were a year ago, and additionally to monitor that. So for every business within your portfolio, understanding where they are from a risk perspective, where they fall against your risk tolerance, and then monitor that, because we do expect to see, as we're seeing with our own database nationally, deterioration over time as businesses start to struggle and suffer, as the economy continues to struggle and suffer. We do also recommend, beyond monitoring just the health of your own customers directly, but as I had just articulated, was to look up the food chain and understand the relationship of your customer within their own family tree. And as we have seen in many catastrophic bankruptcies prior to COVID, that businesses are a house of cards. And if the parent company files for bankruptcy, then often we start to see that trickle down the family tree, and the result is not one simple bankruptcy, but multiple bankruptcies. Another approach that we are recommending to our customers is beyond just monitoring your own customers for losses, but to also understand the health of your suppliers, your critical suppliers, so that you can also anticipate your own business interruptions. The last is to prioritize your collection strategies, and whether or not it's following the methodology that I provided to you 2 slides ago, but to create a segmentation around the clients that you're dealing with and understanding the risks associated with them so that you can apply different strategies to the different segments to be the most effective. It's not always possible to apply the same collection strategy across every single outstanding account. So to be able to prioritize the strategy, the activity levels, and the approach to the different segments will have the greatest result in reducing the bad debt and also have an effect on the turnaround in the days sales outstanding. Next slide over. To be very prescriptive when you're reviewing your credit approval process, we do recommend that you look very closely at the different geographies. As Adam had shared with you earlier, we do see different behavior across provinces, whether or not it's the risk levels within the provinces or the impact within the provinces themselves of COVID. So defining a strategy that treats the provinces differently or individually is critical at this point in time. And also looking at what line of business is your customer in that is generating the majority of their economic income. So we are treating, of course, any business within the travel or entertainment sector very differently than we are agriculture, because the effect of COVID on these businesses is different. We, of course, provide insight around the different predictive indicators, whether or not it's a definition of failure, filing for bankruptcy, delinquency, severe delinquency in excess of 90 days, or voluntary cessation. And you can look at these factors independently, but what we find is it provides a greater insight into not just the capacity, but also the credibility and the character of an organization to create different segments of collection strategies. Whatever your new credit approval process or your current credit approval process for onboarding, we recommend you start at the root and take a look at any new businesses that are in your pipeline or that are looking to onboard and apply the same methodology of risk identification against the prospects so that you're not while you're opening up the door for onboarding or new business prospects that are just going to continue to create problems for you. Identify that parental ownership and material relationship amongst all levels of the businesses that you're dealing with, and continue to reevaluate your risk thresholds. So we can't be complacent. We do know that this is going to be a bit of a long run, and we want to be able to reevaluate risk tolerances, reevaluate what risk we are onboarding, and the segmentation of our existing portfolio on a continued basis. Next slide. If you haven't done so already, take a look at what your exposure and the methodology for assigning credit limits or the exposure, and also leverage the family tree or the DUNS number to understand what your aggregated exposure is. So as I have mentioned, 1 in 5 businesses in Canada are related to each other. So you may not realize that you have 2 organizations with very different names, but actually common ownership, so that it's going to exacerbate your exposure to a family unless you understand that relationship across the entire family organization. Continue to monitor the portfolio. It's going to shift, it's going to change. We are seeing changes across our own database and our own metrics on a daily basis. It certainly is fluid. And as we see certain segments being rolled out to phase 3, or as we're certainly seeing, certainly here in Ontario, things rolling back to phase 2, it's going to be an ongoing challenge to understand who is in a high-risk segment. So ongoing monitoring becomes critical for both your customers and your suppliers. Leveraging these kinds of approaches and tactics will give you the ability to create a very diverse collection strategy to have the greatest impact. So identifying those businesses that require high touch versus those that you can sort of push aside and not spend as much time or effort on because they look to be financially sound and stable and create low risk. Create those strategies by geography, by industry, by risk sectors, and also by the size of the business, small, medium, large. You may want to create compassionate strategies to help the economy by treating small businesses with little or low risk associated with them differently than a large-sized organization that is in a very high-risk category. And one thing I'm certainly seeing a lot of out there in the commercial sector is our clients are offering alternative payment options. So whether or not it's newly accepting credit cards, partial payments, we're certainly seeing payment plans, we're seeing extended terms in order to create that flexibility and create that opportunity for your clients to continue in business and also continue to do business with you. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Christie. We're actually going to put up a third poll now as we look for your feedback on this webinar. Please let us know what you think. And I don't see any questions in the Q&A pod. If anybody has any questions, please enter them now, or you can certainly raise your hand and we will unmute you. Let me ask you this, actually. This is a question for perhaps Christie, but you know, at Dun & Bradstreet Canada, how have we changed our own internal credit and collections processes in response to this pandemic? Can you share that? I believe you're on mute.
There, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. DB obviously follows our own best practices and recommendations that we share with our customers. And we too have a formalized policy of running a credit check or a health check on any new customer or any customer that is looking to renew their relationship with D&B. And we do a credit check on every single organization. We are now in the pattern of looking at these health checks 90 days out before the terms of an agreement come up for renewal so that we can anticipate ahead of time whether or not there's been a material change in our customer or the health of the organization, so we can pivot and determine how do we wish to proceed with a customer and how do we want to partner with them. And as well, we have also ensured that we have a consistent adoption of credit pre-approval for any new customer that we're doing business with. We too are working with our customers. We are being asked often to offer different terms, different payment options, and we're flexible in working with our customers as best as we possibly can in order to ensure that we can continue to do business with them, because it's a trickle-down effect. If we can't help our customers identify their own risk within their portfolio, then it becomes even more difficult for them to manage risk, offset losses, and continue to do business.
Thank you. Perfect. Do any of you have any closing remarks? Tom, Christie, Adam?
I do, Sherry. There's a lot of information. We've tried to bring this into a 45-minute presentation and webinar format. Reach out. And we have assembled some resources that are available to support you after the webinar. And let me just briefly review those. Still in line with, you know, reaching out as our goal here. We produce on a quarterly basis a global business risk report that's generated out of the organization that Adam is a part of. The article on compassionate approach to revenue collections is available on our Perspectives site as part of the dnb.com. And strategies for a more effective collections policy. While designed for the commercial customers, it's equally relevant to government. And this is newly published, so it's definitely worth a look, and it's very well done. Last but not least, and this is an invitation to everyone on the phone, we have a service that'll help you get started. So a lot of information has been shared with you. Some may wonder, what do I do next? How do I begin? How do I take that first step? It's easy. You contact one of the folks listed on the slide that's going to follow. Don't go there yet, Sherry. That's a good way to get started. And what do? We will complete a health scan of your portfolio. A portfolio that could be a segment of a subsection of your total portfolio. It can be the portfolio in its entirety. And that the goal is to match to an accurate DUNS number and to draw in all of the third-party insights that we've been talking about here. We produce a report. It's a couple of pages. There is no fee to government to use this service to get started. The insights out of the health scan help you to take that first step. And now, one final note on the resources. Everything here is there are embedded links in for each of the listed resources. And last but not least is Sherry, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers and to all of you participants for your time today. These are just some of the folks that participated today. Please feel free to take down our emails or our telephone numbers and reach out. And on that note, have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks
everybody.
Thank you.